What if I told you that there was a guy who single-handedly saved millions of lives and ended up creating some of the most important tools in modern medicine? Oh no, not that guy again. Not the old man with a wild white beard. That's not him. This guy is actually French, and his name is Louis Pasteur. When he was young, he wanted to be an artist, but his father made him study science instead. And since then, his life has been all about science. He uncovered the secrets of why wine goes bad. He created the world's first vaccines, and he discovered how to keep milk from turning sour. He even found proof that tiny microorganisms are responsible for making cheese and yogurt. But what was life like for this French scientist, and how did he end up saving so many people? Let's find out. In 1854, Louis Pasteur had just become director of a chemical research laboratory at a prestigious university. As part of his job, he was supposed to figure out why wine in the region wasn't fermenting properly. The local winemakers were having a serious problem. Their wine would turn sour and become undrinkable after only a few weeks. It was costing them lots of money, and they needed Pasteur's help. Back then, winemaking was a pretty gross process. Farmers would pick grapes, put them in a big container, and let nature do its thing. Basically, it would sit around getting warmer and gradually turn into wine. At least, that was the idea. But now winemakers were seeing something strange happen. Sometimes the wine would go bad before it was even done fermenting. It would taste sour and look like this. And not only that, but if someone drank it, they could get seriously ill. To find out what was going on, Pasteur went to the farmers and got some of the sour wine to study. When he looked at samples of it under the microscope, he saw something crazy. There were tiny little organisms swimming around in it. They were like tadpoles, except with a tail on each end. He named them after the Latin word for yeast, which means little fungus. He thought these little creatures must be causing the wine to spoil. But when he tried to prove this, he accidentally disproved it. You see, he boiled some of the wine to kill the little animals, then put it in a bottle and sealed it up tight. To his surprise, it didn't go bad. So it seemed like those little guys weren't the problem. But then he left the next batch of wine uncovered overnight, and guess what happened? It went bad again. This time he noticed something even stranger. If he looked at the surface of the wine right before it started to spoil, he saw little specks floating around. He took a closer look and realized they were full of those same little tadpole-like creatures. These were the culprits. These tiny animals could survive in the air as little specks, waiting for a chance to fall into some sweet, fermented grape juice. Once they did, they would multiply and turn the wine sour. But by boiling the wine, Pasteur killed them. That's why his sealed bottle didn't spoil. Unfortunately, those little critters could survive being boiled for a little while. That's why he needed to leave the wine uncovered overnight. That gave the spores a chance to fall into the wine and start multiplying. Until it turned sour, Pasteur figured out a way to stop them from spoiling the wine. All he had to do was heat it up for a really long time, then cool it down really fast. This process killed the little animals without letting them have a chance to reproduce. After this process, the wine was safe to drink, and because it was heated, it also lasted much longer. Winemakers were so happy they could finally sell their wine without worrying about it going bad, and all thanks to a scientist who was interested in art. But this discovery led Pasteur to another question. How does heating food affect the microbes inside it? Maybe that could explain why milk turned sour too. In the 1860s, pasteurization became a common process for keeping milk fresh. All it takes is heating it up to 86 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. Then it has to be cooled really fast. This kills most of the bacteria in the milk, but it doesn't make it sterile. You can still see tiny microbes moving around in it. If you look closely, those little bugs aren't harmful though. They're actually beneficial bacteria that play an important role in our body. Louis Pasteur is considered one of the founders of microbiology, the study of all things tiny and invisible, and yet he never saw a virus in his entire life. A virus is a tiny piece of genetic material wrapped in a coat of protein. Some viruses use RNA, but others use DNA. You might have heard of DNA. Every living thing on Earth has it, and it's what makes you you. Well, a virus is kind of like a bad piece of DNA. It's sneaky and manipulative, and it hijacks your cells to multiply. It turns out that viruses are everywhere, and they've been here the whole time. But we could unsee them until Anton van Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope more than 200 years before Pasteur was born. Without that invention, none of what Pasteur accomplished would have been possible. Even though Pasteur was the one who discovered germs, he definitely wasn't the first person to come up with the idea of cleanliness. For example, the Hindu god Ganesh is shown carrying a scrub brush in ancient carvings, and he's been worshipped for more than 3,000 years. Likewise, the Egyptians believed that washing your hands prevented illness more than 1,000 years ago. They even carved pictures of people washing their hands on the walls of their tombs. When they dug up those tombs hundreds of years later, people were pretty grossed out. But archaeologists have found that people have been cleaning themselves for thousands of years. And of course, people knew that washing your hands with soap and water helped prevent illness, but they didn't know why. In 1876, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis was working in a hospital in Vienna. One day he noticed that patients who gave birth in hospital beds were much more likely to die from infection than those who gave birth at home. He wondered if this had something to do with doctors doing autopsies and then delivering babies without washing their hands in between. At first, his colleagues thought this was ridiculous. Who would want to listen to a doctor talking about dirty hands? But eventually they agreed to try his idea, and it worked. By telling doctors to wash their hands with chlorinated lime, he dramatically reduced the number of women who died. Ignaz Semmelweis was a hero, except he was ignored for decades and ended up dead. Today, we know that there are trillions of different types of bacteria in the human body. We have good bacteria inside us that keep us alive, but if any of those bacteria got into our bloodstream, we'd probably die. Your skin acts like a wall to keep the bad bacteria out, but you can't cover every surface of your body with skin. For example, if you breathe through your stomach, you die. That's why it's really important that the air you breathe is clean. About 100 years ago, a scientist named Robert Koch was studying tuberculosis. He's famous for figuring out what causes anthrax. While studying tuberculosis, he grew some bacteria in a special glass container. He left half of it covered with a cotton plug and left the other half uncovered. He expected both of them to grow, but the one with the cotton plug ended up looking way better. What was going on? Why did the bacteria grow faster in the covered jar? This led him to invent a device that would change the future of biology. Robert Koch invented an incubator with a special filter that trapped tiny particles in the air. It looked like this, and soon scientists all over the world were using it to grow tiny microbes. Later on, scientists built incubators that could filter out almost all microbes in the air. These days, we call them HEPA filters, and they're what keeps the air in hospitals and labs nice and clean. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were both bacteriologists, meaning they specialized in studying bacteria. But it turns out that there are more types of microbes out there that aren't bacteria. In the early 1900s, a scientist named Martinus Bezerenc was studying tobacco plants. He noticed that sometimes the leaves of the plant would curl up and turn yellow. Then they'd start to rot, and the whole plant would die. He noticed that rubbing the leaves together would spread this disease to other plants. He thought maybe it was a type of bacteria, but when he looked at samples under the microscope, He didn't see anything. He decided to squeeze some of the sap from the rotting leaves into a filter with a really fine mesh. He used the same filter that Robert Koch used to trap bacteria. He expected to see bacteria in the unfiltered sap, but the filtered version was totally clear. Whatever was making the plants sick was small enough to pass through the filter. This led Martin Spagerink to discover the first virus. Pasteur never saw a virus in his lifetime, but he foresaw the importance of microbiology. He said that the advance of medical science depended entirely on our knowledge of the lower forms of life. Because of his curiosity, he ended up saving millions of lives. Hit the subscribe and like buttons for more documentaries done by generative AI. Thanks for watching.